So, Satyen, I'd like to start with you. We're all aware of the garbage in, garbage out problem. Bad data leads to bad outcomes. But how does this play out in the world of AI?
So generative AI poses a different structure for analyzing data than the traditional pipeline. Historically, when we've analyzed data, we basically take all of this unstructured data or we build an application and software applications, and we try to extract information by structuring a data model. And so we try to make structure from the unstructured thing. In the generative context, it's a little bit different because you're effectively shortcutting that entire process. You're taking all of this unstructured information and you're feeding it into a model. You're vectorizing it, as it were, and as a consequence of all of that, you're basically then getting it's almost a black box, and you're getting an output. And that output, there's no way to check the information that's going into it. Whatever you feed it, it absorbs. And so this idea of generating these models becomes a lot more tricky because now there's no way to really intrinsically check how that data is processed, what's going on in the middle of the model. If you give it garbage, you're going to get garbage. Even if you give it good data, you might get garbage.
Mm-hmm. So, Geraldine, we're talking about data. You're with GXS Bank. Could you tell us a bit more about what the bank is trying to do and why data is so critical to that objective?
Yeah, so GXS Bank is one of the 4 full digital banking license that was given 4 years ago by MAS. It is made out of the Grab Singtel Digital Consortium. I think one of the key CVP that we have in the bank is to leverage data to do things differently in terms of pricing, credit risk scoring, as well as enabling financial inclusion, financial mobility to customers who today might not be served by local banks. And when we started the journey 4 years back, I think Satyen has been with us on this journey as well. And the importance about getting the quality data, the right types of metadata involved inside your data lake is so crucial in building those models that we talked about. Alternative data sources are so important when we started off as a new bank. Imagine having to do credit risk scoring or risk-based pricing from scratch without any forms of history of the data of your customers. This was the experience that we had. If I had to summarize the journey thus far, I think the first year was really about getting governance in place, policies, frameworks, the tools like Satyen is using or has created in place as well, processes in place, and then you realize that in year 2, those processes might not work, and you go back and revise some of these processes. The collection of data is so important. You need to be able to understand the customer journey, embed them at the touch points of the customers, because if you do it as after the fact, then you're missing out on all this information data collection that you're collecting. And then building up those models, refining it, and including those feedback loops that your customers are giving you signals from before you actually put it into production as well. So I would say I would summarize this as a 4-year journey.
Mm-hmm. So, Satyen, so you have a client, a customer who comes to you with a data problem they want to solve. How do you start the conversation about data quality, about data intelligence at Alation?
The interesting thing about data intelligence is that often when customers come to us, they say they want to organize their data. And often these are very complicated companies with lots of legacy data and systems that has existed over, in some case, decades, and so in some case, multiple decades. And there's this view that you can sort of organize all of that data in some period of time, that like if we just put some work into it and we buy the right software and buy the right tools, all of a sudden, all of this data will get organized. Now, interestingly, it doesn't work that way at all, because most of the time, recreating all of the information that's produced this information, navigating all of this code, navigating all of this software is almost impossible to do. Mm-hmm. Most of these companies have been built over thousands and tens of thousands of projects with hundreds of thousands of databases, each of which have tens of thousands of data sets themselves. And so to try to do all that archaeology is really very difficult. And then to try to make all of that data go to higher quality is also difficult. And it also, frankly, depends on the use case. And so often, what we recommend is for customers to work from the end backwards. You first have to start and think, what am I trying to do? And what are the relevant bits of data? And often that's not very apparent because some bits of data might answer a question before you even knew that that data existed. And so it's an iterative process for sure, and it's not one that's always a straight line. But it is the case that you have to work from the end backwards. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where you can get quickly lost and you can lose a lot of money.
And how often is it that that legacy data just ends up being useless to whatever problem you're trying to solve?
Quite often.
Yeah.
Quite often. Either because it was incorrect, or because you couldn't find it appropriately, or because the system that contained it wasn't actually the authoritative source.
So Geraldine, you mentioned in your answer about you having to get alternate data sources, which requires working with ecosystem partners, getting their data, getting them to share that data responsibly. And I'm reminded of financial inclusion. The reason why it's hard to serve these customers is because there isn't enough information out there to build the right customer profile, to build the right risk profile. So, how are you and GXS Bank trying to solve this problem by getting the data that you need to serve these customers?
So in Singapore, I think most of us here have records in the Credit Bureau of Singapore. However, in Indonesia, in our regional countries, this might not be so. And this is when we rely on alternative data sources such as from Grab and Singtel. When we first started this journey, we had to work closely with Singtel and Grab to use them as proxies. So if you think about Grab, how your financial behavior and some of their financial wallets, your buy now, pay later, on the Singtel side, you would think about bill repayment behavior, for example. Those are simple proxies that we could use. But they are strong signals for us to build a starting model as well as a feature engineering. And from there, we actually, I'll term it as a cold start problem in doing risk-based pricing as well as credit risk scoring. And with that, I think what we have done is to be able to offer small little loans to people who have no bureau or thin bureau. That's what we call in Singapore, who otherwise today might not be served by the traditional banks. In doing so, what you're doing is to be able to get records of them for their regular repayment behavior coming back. And once this has been determined to be regular and reliable, we are then able to increase the amount of loans to them as well. I think this helps in creating those financial inclusion and mobility for some of these customers who might not be able to get a loan otherwise.
So we are open to questions from the floor. So if you have any questions, think about them as I ask Satyen this question. So you talked before about too much data, too much legacy data, getting a handle on that. But the opposite problem is not having enough data. And there's been a lot of discussion about ways to solve that. And one of the solutions proposed is synthetic data, artificially created data, to expand your training set. What are your thoughts on synthetic data? Is it a workable solution to this problem, or does it do more harm than good?
It certainly can be quite valuable given the right context. So essentially what you're doing with synthetic data is you're taking real data, real documents inside of a company that might instead have confidential information or trade secrets, and you're essentially tokenizing it and changing the actual content, but leaving the structure of that content in place. And so if that metastructure is altered completely, then you might lose the learnings. And so it really depends on how the transformations occur, what the use cases and the outcomes might end up being. But it certainly has a place and it certainly has a use. And in a world where we're looking for more and more data, and these models are so voracious and their appetite is so big, it is a helpful thing to have in a world where we need to get more information to make the models better.
Any questions from the audience? Well, in that case, Geraldine, you were one of GXS Bank's first employees. You had to build this data culture from scratch. Could you tell us a bit more about that experience, what it was like, getting everyone on the same page when it comes to dealing with data responsibly, protecting data privacy? Like, what was that story like?
I think it was fortunate that we were one of the first few employees. It signified a lot to what data was in the company as one of the first employees to be employed. As new people came on board, I think what I experienced was their understanding of what data team does for them, what analytics does for them, what data science is for them. It's all varied levels of maturity. One of the things that I tried doing was, and this was back during COVID time, so we were building a digital bank remotely on Zoom when teams of 2 people could meet with each other. So it was a lot of educating, meeting with them to understand what their needs were, their expectations were, but also creating an operating model to say, hey, what does the data team actually do? What can it benefit you? What are some of the use cases that we have seen in the past being adopted within your business unit? How does it help you? How are you going to adopt that? And also being able to assess their level of maturity was very important for us. Secondly, I think tools like Alation, for example, the other tools that we use for data visualization, trying to democratize a lot of the data to the users, to the hands of the users. So users in the bank are able to search for data definitions, what is in the bank itself through Alation, for example. And they have trust in the data that they see. This is really important because reliability on the data and the quality of the data is a key component to using the data. And putting it, expanding it into a dashboard and visualization is what helps the users create those use cases, create the problem statements that they use data to solve for as well.
And then, similar question to you. I mean, if you were to give advice to a business leader about how to build a strong data culture in their organization, what would be the sorts of advice you would give them?
So culture is effectively just a set of habits and behaviors that exist, right, within any organization. And so those habits and behaviors exist on some level by default. And the real thing to incentivize, I mean, if we're trying to build a habit, if we want to stop smoking, if we want to eat better quality food, you really want to build in immediate rewards. And what people do in the data path often that makes that journey go awry is there's too much organizing, too much money being spent, too many organizational meetings about my definition is better than your definition. Mm-hmm. And you get into this work and you get lost. And so what we find the best companies do and the best customers do is they tie their outcomes to value very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so the work that they do is often very clearly measurable and very clearly outcome-oriented. And the stories are very quickly socialized. And so what you find is that momentum often ends up being super useful because if you can get 1 or 2 wins, then you can get a couple more. The other thing, though, that I find super valuable is that you tie to the most important problems of the business. Yeah. The thing about data teams is they can work on anything. It's ultimately an enablement service. And so how do you know which problems to tie to? It's the ones that the executive cares about the most. And often we find that data teams forget about this. They just work on the problems that are most interesting. But the interesting problems aren't the ones that are going to necessarily make you or save you money. Mm-hmm.
And what about you, Geraldine? What lessons would you kind of offer to leaders going through this journey themselves?
I would say you really need the buy-in of the top management and even getting everyone together in getting a business sponsor is so important because like what Satyen was saying is tying the matrix of success to a business sponsor and showing them those quick wins as well is so important.
So Satyen, I'm gonna use a bit of a rude term on stage here. On social media, there's a term now being thrown around, AI slop, low quality data, low quality products generated by Gen AI programs. And there's a fear that it's just lowering the overall quality of stuff on the internet. How do you kind of prevent that feedback loop from happening? How do you prevent low quality generated AI products from polluting the data set and making your own AI output worse and then having this like negative cycle towards just having really bad quality stuff produced by your AI models?
Yeah, and of course, the slop begets more slop.
Yeah.
And we're, of course, in a United States election year, and you're going to see misinformation, which is sort of even a worse form of the slop. So there's lots of answers to that question. But one of them is, interestingly, of course, there's AIs to detect the bad AIs, which can only, of course, go so far. There's manual intervention. There's model training. But then there's vigilance, right? We all have to be sort of aware of the information that we're consuming and understand what is right or wrong. And that's a form of literacy that I think doesn't exist as critically as it should in the digital world. I mean, we certainly all get, phished. We get SMSs that effectively are trying to defraud us into sending gift cards and money. But we have to realize that some of this information is a light form of phishing. They're trying to convince us of messages that may not be true or bad information. And so it's a multi-pronged thing. I mean, truth is a hard thing to come by, and it's work.
So Geraldine, I remember I was talking to a VC once, and he made the point that, the world of fintech, the opportunities in fintech are not actually in centers like Hong Kong, even in Singapore, where the regulation is very strong, there's a well-developed financial system, but a lot of the opportunity is in emerging markets, where the systems are less developed, there's less infrastructure. As people are thinking about financial inclusion, fintech in these less developed markets, how do they need to think about data? Is the data going to be harder to come by? Are concerns about, again, data privacy, working with partners more important? As you move to wilder markets than Singapore, what do people have to keep in mind?
I think I'll draw lessons from what we have in the bank as well. I think the first thing that I mentioned earlier was about data sharing agreements in place with our shareholders. I think this can be a lateral learning lesson, having those proper data sharing agreements, things with consent, who collects consent as part of this whole customer journey is really important as well. I recall days and nights poring over that document, but operationalizing it is equally tough because each organization have their own mechanism, own channel for which data is being shared. The other thing is, how do you also do audits on each other's data storage, right? How do they protect the data? And there are agreements in place such that it states down how that data would be stored properly and used in an appropriate manner for certain users, for certain purposes only. I think that's from a data protection, data sharing point of view. The second thing is about how do you use the data. We spoke about alternative data sources. I think a lot of learnings could be used in, for example, credit risk profiling, in acquisition of customers as well. So you lower your cost of acquisition through your partners, but how do you use those alternative data sources to create a flywheel as well and help both sides of the data sharing partners to do customer acquisition as well as credit risk profiling, where data sources such as the credit bureau, Singapore might not be available. Alternative data sources would be where you leverage and create the risk profile as well.
So, very quick question to you, Geraldine. GXS Bank launched August 2022. ChatGPT launches 3 months later, which changes the whole conversation about AI and data. I mean, are you expecting any other surprises when it comes to data and AI?
I do see that right now there's a lot of Gen AI being done in a very task level manner that should be expanded into a more enterprise workforce impact type of flow. The workflow, this is where I see transformation in the workflow, entire processes. And this is dependent on where each organization defines end-to-end. Because the end-to-end workflow for me might be very different to, say, in Satyen's organization. And I think it's about us applying individual organizations' mindset to see where those gaps are to implement the Gen AI for workflow impact on Gen AI.
And I mean, we were talking earlier, I mean, this is still all very new, and I think a lot of companies, especially non-tech companies, are still grappling with this new tech. I mean, how long?
And the tech companies too.
Yeah, and how long will it take, you think, for this literacy to really break into, outside of the tech sphere to these other companies?
So I think the thing that's unpredictable with this technology is that you don't know how quickly the models themselves are improving. And then there are other techniques in the general world of AI, like deep reinforcement learning, that could sort of really improve the quality and the capability of what these models can do. So that is, I think, somewhat unpredictable, but could be quite revolutionary. But even given the technology, let's just say this, we stopped developing these new models. I would argue that it's going to be certainly years and possibly decades before we can get to the level of adoption that really has most of these institutions absorbing this technology in the way that they need to. I mean, we're so early in terms of understanding what use cases are appropriate, how these models can be used, how to tune them appropriately, what the right prompts are. I mean, there's just so many things that we have yet to learn that, and how to integrate the right data into it. So there's a lot to do, and I think just tons of excitement in front of us.
Well, we will definitely experience more unpredictability in the world of AI in the years to come. Thank you so much, Satyen. Thank you so much, Geraldine, for talking about AI-ready data today. Please give a round of applause.